Hello and welcome to this discussion which seeks to focus on the artist's experience of the Playhouse's Peace Academy, the Peace 4 programme that has given rise to 4 major theatre productions and a whole range of satellite activities. We're sat here on the set of the final production, Anything Can Happen, Damien Gorman's placing on stage of stories from the year 1972. So if you feel you've been catapulted back into an orgy of nostalgia, the set is deliberately designed to evoke memories of the early 1970s for those that lived through it, and to act as a sort of time travel for those that didn't. We're also looking out at an auditorium filled with mementos of lost loved ones, because when it became clear, because of the present situation, the Playhouse couldn't invite a living audience into the theatre. Instead, the actors every night share their stories with the memories of so many other participants that are represented here. I'm delighted to welcome a range of the artists that have been participating in the programme over the last 2 years. When the programme was originally set up, and the idea of a Peace Academy, I think, is very central to it, the idea of learning. 4 artists were invited to lead the kind of larger projects, and then another range of artists were applied to be working with them on their own projects. And I'm glad to say that today we represent both those constituencies. But as I think everyone here will agree, the people who led the larger projects have enjoyed a very equal dialogue, I think, with the people who led the other projects. And while I think initially it was imagined that some kind of external expertise would be brought into Northern Ireland through the bigger projects, with Jo Egan, who will be the first person to speak and tell us a bit about her own production, The Crack and Everything. I think it's fair to say that your practice, although you're technically from outside this corner of the island, is rooted in a lifetime's experience of using the arts in community contexts, and often in the spirit of community dialogue. And Ailin Conant, who has a more international sort of perspective in terms of her work, I think has also benefited, I think, from talking to people whose practice is rooted here, including Pamela Brown, who leads creative writing programs, but has developed really innovative practices around podcasting. And Conan McIvor, who came in to work with video as on this current show for Jo Egan's performance. So you've been very much embedded in the whole Peace Academy project, but also then took the opportunity as one of the so-called local artists to develop your own film project. So a conversation of equal participants here, I think. But we're going to start with you, Jo, because chronologically yours was the first to take to this very stage, The Crack and Everything. Do you want to tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, it became a multimedia piece of testimonial theatre. The theme was about 6 children who were murdered in the Troubles. Originally, we kind of felt, well, is this going to be too traumatizing for both the participants who might engage and audiences? And it actually became apparent quite quickly that there was a silence around this, that actually some of the families felt their narratives had been neglected. And we found, with the help of organisations like Holywell Trust, Dennis Bradley, and the Pat Finucane Centre, particularly Paul O'Connor, they were fundamental in us being able to access families that were going to work on the project. So we had 6 families, and I started interviewing various members of those families, friends that had been, childhood friends, and interviewed over 20 people, and ended up with over 30 hours of testimony, which we had to distill into 90 minutes. So it was roughly about 15 minutes for each family. And the simplest thing to do, really, because we were using the time 1971 to 1981. It was within that time period that all the killings happened. We put the play on chronologically. The stories went on chronologically, so that somebody could get that sweep of what was actually happening with the Troubles as well. So we were able to give a bit of the background context to each of the times that the killings happened in.
And you adopted the theatre of witness methodology to a large extent, in that the stories were told by individuals on stage, but you sort of experimented with the form a little in the way you actually cast the piece, I think, didn't you?
Yeah, when we were doing the research and when we were trying to find the families, what originally that started popping up was that it was children who were almost descended from the killings. So it could be nieces, nephews, grandchildren, had in some way become artists themselves and had started making work around this previous tragedy that had happened in the family. So that was a real sort of red flag moment. I thought, well, that would be really interesting. So when we were looking at the families, rather than the person that would have been the almost first port of call who experienced the trauma, we'd also looked at nieces and nephews in the families that would have grown up with the story, but were willing to carry that tale for the family. So we had 2 family members from that were cast, Sarah Morrison and Maria McGavigan. And then we actually had Marjorie Leslie, who was in the Claudy bombing and was there when Catherine Egan was killed. She was there also in the hospital with her. After that, then we also had 3 what would be termed professional actors, but they also had a history of involvement. One of the professional actors, her uncle had been shot, and other people's families had suffered trauma as a result of being involved in the Troubles. So even though they were professional actors, they also carried the experience.
And I love the fact that echoes recur across the projects. Watching Damien's piece last night, there was the family, the story was told by the child who was her mother was pregnant with her when her brother was killed. I think there was a similar kind of cross-sibling storytelling in your case.
Yeah, I think what was very big for us was some certain families had spoken a lot about the incident within the family, had gone down through the generations. There were some families that hadn't spoken about it at all, and the first time they really spoke about it was to me. One of the mothers of the children spoke to me, and so that when some of the other family members, we did a small showing beforehand for each of the families, so that they could sort of sign off on the piece that was to be performed, and it became apparent that some of the family members had never heard the story in that much detail or in that much fullness, and so this was new information to them.
And again, last night we saw the Bogside artists, the painting of Annette, which again was something that featured in your project.
Absolutely, we had Annette McGavigan's family, and Maria McGavigan was Annette's niece, and she was the one that was able to carry that story for the family.
Do we have an image from Jo's piece available?
We do. One of them is of Maria and Annette. Yeah.
Do you want to just contextualize?
Yeah, so with each of the the 3 from the families that could tell the stories of the children they were representing, they became a narrator, and then the rest of the actors played the other parts, so to speak. And so Maria was one of the narrators of Annette McGavigan's story, and her own father and her Aunt May were the key people that I interviewed. And then because Paul O'Connor up at the Pat Finucane Centre, they've still got a legal case outstanding. They're still seeking justice for Annette. Paul actually also became one of the characters that was able to speak about the case. So those 3 characters were the narrators, and then the other 3 actors chipped in about, this other person might have said that. Yeah. And
again, so much of the staging of these stories, trying to animate what are essentially talking heads, have driven a really innovative practice in terms of that multimedial dimension. So perhaps if I pass the baton now to Conan, who, if you just want to talk briefly maybe about your role in Jo's piece and perhaps Damien's piece before talking to us about your own film.
Sure. Yeah, well, one of the interesting things about Jo's piece was that a lot of it was all very heavily documented in the press. So, I spent a lot of time going through newspaper clippings and going through the library archives and picking out all the kind of annotations of all these different plot points, if you like, along their different stories, because I've been really fascinated by, the kind of almost like the facade of these accounts in this, and what Jo was doing was kind of getting behind the story, you know, behind the headline, and accessing the kind of the personal story. But I was looking to juxtapose that with these really tragic newspaper, you know, headlines, and so what we did was we ended up projecting them on the windows of the Playhouse against the backdrop of the city scape. So. Yeah, so that's what I did with Jo's piece.
I should say, just in the room we're sitting now, when we open these windows, you actually look out on the city and the hills
It's
above.
a phenomenal view, you know, to actually access from a theatre space. And so having that dimension layered on top of that was really very moving. And then in Damien's piece, you know, there's that kind of there's sort of aspects that have kind of crossed over. So like Annette's piece, for instance, or the mural to Annette. It features as well in Damien's show, but we've approached it in a different way. We have this idea of like stretching history and reanimating it in a different way on stage through this TV gauze frame.
Which is actually not behind us at the moment, but the empty frame is.
The empty frame is. And so it's been really, I mean, that for me, it's been fascinating to actually just dive into these stories and spend time, you know, actually even just the process of working on Jo's and spending time going through the papers in the 70s and everything. It's actually, what I found actually really moving was how all this, you know, tragedy is just in black and white in and amongst, you know, sales and shops and different things and like adverts, and it was just like how, you know, I have no appreciation for what that is like. You know, I grew up at the tail end of like I was 14 whenever the Good Friday Agreement was signed. So
led to those terrible phrases like an acceptable level of violence.
Yeah. So it was an experience I'd never really had gone through before.
So then, being part of the Peace Academy family, you had a project a film project of your own.
Yeah,
which this
I'm trying to
allowed
remember
you
whether the film came before or after your show. I think it was maybe before, was it?
Making it at the same time.
Same time,
yeah.
Well, the film, basically, very long story short, my partner, Michael, who's a writer and a doctor, this was our fourth short film that we made together, but he had been working in Derry in a scheme that was taking hospital care into the community, so going into nursing homes, you know, visiting vulnerable people and hearing their stories in and amongst, as doctors do, and amongst treating them. And he was a lot of his patients had dementia or suffering from dementia and other types of illnesses like that. So we had this this idea around, you know, these people who may be, you know, involved in different aspects of the Troubles, and their stories are being lost through time, through illness. And
remind us of the name of the film.
So the name of the film is Forgive Me Not. So it's play on Forget Me Not, but so Forgive Me Not, I'll just read the log line just so I can contextualize it. So Martin, a former paramilitary involved in the abduction and murder of a Troubles victim, visits the senile wife of one of his victims every day in search of atonement. So he visits her every day. She's suffering dementia. She's struggling to understand who he is, and every day he confesses to her. And really, we actually had trouble. We had this kind of story concept, and there wasn't very much interest actually in conventional film channels.
In terms of its form, I mean, it's got quite expressionist elements, which I suppose are hard to sell in any
even just
context.
from I think from a concept point of view, I don't know. It's sometimes, you know, people can be a bit still standoffish about you know, funding Troubles related work. And then whenever the opportunity came to apply to the Peacebuilding Academy, we engaged with that. But actually, what that actually offered us more than just the funding, which was great in itself, but the opportunity to engage with a selection of participants who had different stories.
It rooted Michael's idea much more in the lived reality.
Absolutely, and it goes back to, you know, for me, one of my concerns about telling this kind of story was like, who am I to tell this kind of story? Sure. You know,
Having said that, Damien reported some of his own witnesses said the same. So it's interesting that insecurity.
Well, that insecurity is what revealed itself to me and gave me the confidence to go, actually, you know, I don't have any great, you know, tragedy to speak to personally, but I do have individual aspects that I never really valued. And it was only through engaging with these participant stories that I actually recognized my own story.
Yeah. That empathetic connection is a theme that runs across the feedback from audiences as well. That's quite a nice segue into your piece, Ailin Conant. Your theme was the first responders who had experienced so much of the frontline experience of the violence. And again, the audience response was very much about that in terms of empathetic connection. It seemed to be a particularly strong connection was made with your storytellers.
I think so. And I'm actually, because this is the first that I've actually heard of this concept of Michael's piece, and that idea of the repetition is so powerful and so evocative and so poetically right for the moment. And I think it's interesting because you talk about how it's hard to get Troubles-related work funded, but I feel like my very limited experience of this place is actually that Troubles-related work is allowed to be funded in a very specific manner and context and form. And in a place where narrative is weaponized, actually you have to stick to these very kind of rigid rules of communicating that narrative, and anything that's expressive or poetic, that actually is where the danger kind of, you know, the danger zone of like, is this allowed?
Just before we move into yours, I realized I was so pleased with my segue. I think we have an image of Conan's piece just to illustrate it.
That's me.
Maybe I'll just speak just quickly to that point. Just, you know, one of the things that I was really passionate about whenever I did was that it wasn't going to be like, you know, a quote-unquote community project in the sense of, you know, getting community act. It was going to be a professional film production, and we were going to bring in professional crew and actors and everything. So there is aspects where I've been involved with things before whereby, okay, you can make that film, but in a particular way, not in a professional way. But I was very keen that this was going to be a professional short film that could travel outside of, you know, a conflict context.
And it has been at a number of festivals, hasn't it? And
yeah.
We saw a brief glimpse there of Stella McCusker in that very powerful performance as the woman with dementia. Eileen, you've got a few images, I think.
Yeah.
So perhaps if you cue those as you describe
let's cue them up now. So my project was working with first responders who had responded to the Troubles over 30 years, and many of these people were retired and had it wasn't just one or two stories. I mean, they had literally hundreds between them, or thousands even. And through the course of that, I worked with, and you can just cue them all if you want to, just keep going through all the pictures. So through the course of the piece, there was so much. You talk about this talking heads situation, and for me, I'm a physical theater director, so I had, for me, I was really interested in sort of the physical stories and what was physically being evoked in all of these images. And as Ursula, who was the person who you saw in the very first image, would constantly remind me, I'm 78 years old, I'm not going to do that, you know, physical theater ridiculousness. And she was absolutely right. And so I brought in, as you can see, a group of young people from the University of Ulster. And originally, it really was just to have a somatic embodiment in the space, to have the ability to kind of visually depict these stories in a way that was theatrical, so that you have this experience of somebody's telling a story, but you can also see the image on stage. But what was really interesting about that was I didn't anticipate the sort of transmission that would happen. That sort of like, I remember one of the most powerful days. I mean, you can see this is the end of the performance, one of the performances, and the people got so emotionally involved in one another's stories. One of the most wonderful rehearsals I remember is Jim, at the very beginning, there's an opening sequence where Jim talks about putting on his fire kit in the back of a fire truck and the exhilaration of that and what that's like. And he had to be very technical. He had to explain, you have to put the mask on this way, you have to get the tank this way, you're holding your tank for the buddy. And you've got 7 young people somatically learning these physical actions through this rehearsal process, and you realize that there are things that are contained in this kind of somatic information that aren't necessarily communicable when you sit down and you tell the story, and then I attended a fire and da-da-da. So that you saw this kind of transmission of information happening in a new way. So that I found was really powerful.
Tell us about the boxes. We saw the backdrop there
Yeah,
of
so
cardboard boxes.
this links in again in terms of the chronology. I came in right after Jo, and I remember sitting in a cafe with Jo and having this incredible conversation where she said to me, because I think my background is that I've done a lot of work with people who would be in professionalized trauma, so soldiers, for example, in places like Rwanda, Lebanon, Israel, Kashmir, and I've done this kind of work working with people across this question of what happens when you have kind of experienced an undue, more than the lion's share of trauma in your kind of professional line of work. And it was really interesting because I was at the beginning of my project and I was really resonating with this idea that you're, as a professional nurse or journalist or therapist, you're coming in contact with stories or experiences more than the average person. And I think it was when I was speaking to Jo that the penny dropped why I was so connected to this, because I was simultaneously also bracing myself. I could feel myself going, what can I do to make sure that I don't get re-traumatized this time? Because when I was in 2012, when I was traveling through XYZ countries, I mean, there were years of sort of personal secondary trauma that and not to say that my experience is anything like being on the front lines. I'm not equating or conflating those two things. But I do think that there's an echo there. And I remember Jo saying to me, you can't protect yourself from this. You just need to accept that after the project, you need to sleep for 2 weeks, like you have the flu, and clear it from your system, and just, And I remember sitting there going, no, I'm not gonna let it happen this time. And then that led me on to this question of what is it that these professional nurses and ambulancemen and firemen, police, what do they do in their daily lives in order to protect themselves? And the answer that I got was that some of them had built really powerful kind of systems of resilience psychologically. Others pushed it away and pushed it away and pushed it away, and it wasn't until retirement hit that they suddenly were overwhelmed by the kind of...
So that was symbolically represented then by the boxes.
And so, thank you so much.
No, I knew where this was going.
He's steering me. It's really good. So so absolutely. So you got this image constantly of these little boxes that you put things, these experiences away in your head in these little boxes. And I remember I was really excited by Pandora's box because I'm a theatre maker, the one box. And I kept getting corrected, which I found interesting, that more than one person said to me, no, not box, boxes. Meaning that you could access one of them, but that wouldn't open everything, that you choose little by little. And I think that really became the sort of centerpiece of the visual image of the piece, which was, the stage full of boxes.
I'm hoping, obviously, to develop the discussion in relation to all these projects, but your emphasis on the somatic experience of learning and the intergenerational aspect, which clearly chimed with Jo's experience as well. I think that sense of accessing ideas through artistic means, Pamela, was very much the starting point for your piece. We were talking earlier about how poetry unlocked the stories of your participants. But perhaps if you just explain briefly the nature of your project, because it was, again, formally quite unusual.
Yeah, when I designed the project, I didn't initially know what group I'd be working with. So. But I had just worked with a women's aid group, and a lot of them, through podcasts, had to remain anonymous. So it was about giving them a voice. So I liked the idea of a voice. How do you give somebody a voice where you really have to listen? So I'd come up, I knew that the podcasts were going to be central to that, and I wanted an installation as well where you could go into a booth, and that connection to somebody's voice became a very intimate experience. I think just because of my own background as a writer, I wanted to transcribe all the interviews that we had booked. And as well as that, I brought in a composer because I wanted some music. I just didn't want the podcast to have generic music that we sourced somewhere online. I wanted the composer to meet the participants as well and get a kind of sense of their personality. So there were a lot of kind of layers to it. Once we were paired with the Wave Centre in Belfast, that was really interesting because we went up, we had a few meetings up there, and I think if you put up the cover of the book, one of the first things that the participants said, that they were very used to people determining their stories through how they look physically. And now suddenly we were coming along and we were saying it's your voice that's
Very
actually
interesting, yeah.
important here. That's what we want people to hear. So there was an interesting challenge for them as well in that respect. I said very early on I didn't want to take a journalistic approach. And again, going back to my own background with poetry, and just how poetry can engage people in conversation, how we can relate to poetry through our own experience, how we interpret a poem can be very much based on our own personal experience. So based on that and knowing the group, I started looking at the war poets. And then I had to select, I had quite a few pieces, and you know, from Siegfried Sassoon, Wilfred Owen, even Catherine Mansfield, writers like that. But there's a Primo Levi poem called The Survivor, and I decided to go with that in the first audio recording. And I just couldn't have anticipated the reaction, because Jennifer McNairn, when we had finished reading the poem, she just said to me, that's like somebody who's been caught up in a bomb blast. And the discussion just opened up, and it was absolutely amazing how they related to that poem.
And then you had a very specific method, because that then drove questions that informed the project. And I think you also talked to me about the significance of the participants interviewing one another. Do you want to say something about that?
We had a concept that each participant would peer interview, and we would devise 36 questions in total, so everybody would get 2 questions on the past, on the present, and on the future. Out of the poetry discussions, we discussed a second poem, which was a more contemporary piece about a punishment shooting. And I just took notes and went off and done up some questions based on that. And then the next session we had was about what questions they felt were relevant, and that was a tough session, and I think also quite challenging for me in terms of just how the content was going to be directed. But I did become very aware that they knew the nuances of each other's story. I didn't, you know, and there's some amazing moments in the podcasts where they can draw out those things that I just would have missed because I didn't know. The level of respect that the participants had for each other during those interviews and allowing each other to tell their stories was just amazing.
I see Jo and Eileen nodding in unison there. I mean, it is an interesting concept, isn't it? The facilitational process is still there, obviously, but perhaps the peer interviewing is more fearless. I mean, I don't know what.
It's kind of like the reflexive interviewing technique, isn't it? But I also found too that sometimes when I was interviewing, if a brother and sister or 2 sisters or a friend or a family member, there would be this little bit of banter between the 2 of them, and that was electric. You know, and somebody, you know, maybe I remember once a sister said, no, you know, I am still very angry about it, and the brother challenged that, and it was absolutely, you know, exactly as Pamela says.
And Aileen, you had guidelines in terms of disclosure, didn't you? I mean, you know, there were areas that you discouraged people from going into, or was it trigger words or?
Oh, that's an interesting one. Yeah, no, everything was kind of up for grabs in terms of, as a group, we had to decide what we were collectively okay with putting out there. And I think that one of the questions that was asked was, there was kind of this tension between people need to know in order to be able to heal, they need to first know what they're healing from, versus, yeah, but you don't need to go into the gratuitous details. There's a certain line after which you don't need to traumatize people. And that was a kind of a live debate. And I don't think it was necessarily solved, because I don't think there is a kind of a pure answer either way. So the way that we kind of incorporated that debate into the piece was to actually stage it. So we actually kind of, what we did was we kind of held the debate in kind of an organic space, and then sort of made it more theatrical by kind of amplifying the direction or pushing.
Again, that somatic method.
Yeah, and there was some like, so for example, one of the moments that I remember really distinctly, there was a fireman who wasn't part of the group, but he very generously gave his voice. So we recorded him, and he told a story which was quite graphic, and there were several things in it. So one was that he was talking about experience of wanting to commit suicide and coming very close. So he actually laid out the methodology by which he the way that he was going to do it. And we were approached by several people kind of from a mental health perspective going, you can't do that because statistically if there are people who are given that's like handing somebody a gun, right? So that kind of editing happening. And then also other things that were just like people feeling that there were things that were too visceral or too uncomfortable, too close to the bone. And the way that we kind of personified that was through these boxes. You could look into it and imagine what it is that the person's looking at, but not necessarily show what's inside that box. Or there were other moments where we actually edited out the text that was spoken, so you heard static. And in that moment, somebody might grab a physical object like a bag and put it back into a box. So this idea of, again, embodying the editing that's happening.
And to acknowledge the right not to speak.
Yeah, I think,
absolutely.
David, also one of the other local artists that was part of my time, there was Conan McIvor, there was also Eileen McLaury, and she did this extraordinary dance piece, and again, Conan worked on that, which was completely non-verbal, and really embodied the experiences. I mean, Conan, you might have something to say about that.
I should say that Maria McManus actually was involved in that, so there was text in it,
There was
but it was
text.
predominantly, I guess, movement based. I don't really want to speak on Eileen's behalf, if you know what I mean.
Well, she's not here, so do.
Yeah.
No, because it's important that we are only a representative here of a huge number of artists. So I think it's nice to celebrate that work too.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I mean, I was more kind of peripherally involved in it, to be honest. But I don't really know what to say.
Well,
about
no,
it.
sorry, I threw that at you. It was just that it was completely the embodiment of how people felt. And Maria's contribution was this beautiful poetic text. But my memory of it is seeing how people moved and reacted, and it reminded me an awful lot of the work of Ailin Conant as well. So it was absolutely amazing representation.
To jump in on that as well, I mean, when you talk about the largest project, like that actually, SUBB, there might be some way of measuring something that's about the actual financial cost of a project, but when you actually talk about the size of that cast and the amount of hours, do you know what I mean? That was one of the larger projects. So just in terms of like what resource was given to this project that might not be accounted for, sort of. I just want to challenge the use of the term larger and smaller, because again, in terms of the mentor-mentee relationship, I felt mentored really by the local artists, and I felt like there was so much knowledge that was brought to me by Pamela. I stole all her ideas.
And I think that, sorry, Pamela,
it was really good that relationship and dynamic was set up for us, that we just even had a sounding board or just moments where we could connect and discuss how things were developing and that kind of thing. So I felt it was really important to have that support. Sometimes as an artist you can feel very isolated, and that was something coming in this project and already it being established that was there. Just one thing that I think is important to say that came out of the podcast talking about further into the future was the talks that the WAVE group do on post-traumatic growth. So if you talk about learning something as an artist, within a project, that was something that really kind of resonated with me. Paul Gallagher does a lot of talks, and he talks about how you kind of deal with trauma or grow from trauma, and it begins, he says, that moment you wake up in the hospital and the nurse that's maybe holding your hand, or the first member of your family that comes in and cleans your brow, or and just developing right through to feeling that you can put your story out there, but that you can grow beyond that trauma, but yet acknowledge that it is part of your backdrop, it's part of your narrative.
And again, one of the things that I realised I didn't introduce myself at the start today, but for those that don't know me, I'm David Grant, and I'm involved as an evaluator in the project through Queen's University. And one of the things we're looking at is what we learn from this as an academy. And I think that kind of related growth that comes from having people bringing expertise from other arenas, like yourself, Eileen, you mentioned the international practice you had, the depth of practice that Jo brought to the project from the various works, community arts projects over the years, Damien's international practice, Robert Ray's experience as a filmmaker, it all seemed to be complemented by that local knowledge. And I think that's perhaps, Eileen, what you're picking up on, that you can have all of the expertise in terms of forms and practice, but knowing, as Damien did through the Cran project, or Lawrence McKeown did through his experience, that dialogue seems to have been very important, matching the artistic work with a deep knowledge of the place.
And oh, sorry, I keep jumping in. Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, I was going to ask you, can I speak to that? Because, you know, for younger artists, you know, who are working in the space, like, I think it's really important, like I'm from Ulster, so I'm not from Derry as such, but, you know, having that, like I worked with Liam a lot in terms of we found these 6 participants that could speak to the themes of the film. We had this film concept, but we didn't, you know, in lots of ways it wasn't kind of fleshed out, you know, so, but as a young artist to drop into a space cold and trying to find relevant people to speak to and hear their stories would have taken a really long time. Plus, you know, I would maybe never really access the right people, but having this knowledge that's, you know, and the Playhouse is one of those rare places that's so deeply embedded within the community that you know, that the value of those participants, those conversations that I had was unbelievable, you know. You know, like one, and the way they informed the film, like one that just comes to mind, for instance, is a lady whose husband was murdered by the IRA. She spoke about how she had nightmares that of the opening the casket and her husband being put together, all mismatched. It's really, you know, even just thinking about it, it's so emotional. And so in the film, there's a funeral scene with an empty coffin. We didn't go full graphic like that, but just to speak to that idea of just empty coffins.
And one of Eileen's participants, a journalist, said it wasn't the murder sites that stopped him working, it was the funerals, because that's where you encountered the grief, the consequences of that. I mean, just picking up on that, what do you all feel has been the kind of response from audiences? I mean, do you have a sense of the impact of your work on participants as well as audiences?
It was mixed. You know, some people said, wow, I heard things there that I'd never heard said about the Troubles before. And that's always really exciting for me, that can be unlocked. Some people said that they felt guilty when they looked at it because maybe they'd been affiliated to one side or another, and they felt that had then impacted on these people's grief. There was people who worked in the legal profession who I mean, you know, within it, all of the 6 cases, I think, in mine, were striving for some kind of justice, some kind of recognition, and they spoke about how distant you had to be to cope at the time that they'd created their little boxes, and seeing some of these stories. So it was mixed. It wasn't always, wow, that was great, it was brilliant to sit through that. But that sort of revolutionary act of bearing witness, because that's what it is if you're prepared to sit and listen and genuinely hear what people are saying, was happening. And there was a very young group. I think, David, you might have spoken to Brassneck Youth. They brought a very young group of people who I thought, my God, this is going to drive them round the bend. Some of them were only about 12, 13, 14. They were riveted the whole way through.
And it prompted conversations with grannies, which they'd never had.
Yeah, yeah.
Pamela?
Yeah, well, we had the installation in Hollywell Trust towards the end of February, and that night we had a really good attendance and very positive feedback. And in some ways you realise that perhaps that is a lot of people that are connected to the project anyway. It's how do you reach a much broader audience? The podcasts were to tour, and we had a date for them to go into Hyde Bank. So
the Young Offenders Centre, yeah.
That's right, but that unfortunately had to go on hold, but we do anticipate that will happen. We are going to put the podcasts up onto some hosting sites. So in terms of audience feedback, we feel that's a kind of a long-term...
A work in progress.
It is.
But what's great is the resilience of that form, that we know it's there. And even the booth can be...
That's right.
I'm sure it's stored as well.
But there was a couple came along from Eglinton that night and found it really, really emotional because they both clearly remembered the shootings that had happened out there and, you know, came along because they felt that there were maybe projects like that they had never been able to access before, you know, that kind of represented their experience.
You've just reminded me of Catherine Aiken's uncle coming to see Jo's play with us at Queen's and telling for the whole audience the experience of him being the doctor in Altnagelvin who had discovered her body. And it turned out he'd never spoken about that before.
Unbelievable. Yeah.
Eileen, response to your piece?
I mean, it's interesting because I think you kind of got the response that you get when, you know, with all of the when you're bearing witness to something. And I think there was a lot of kind of resonance in the audience and people kind of identifying with that experience. I think that the bit that kind of was novel or particular to this performance, I think actually it was it was completely by chance, but it was actually the intergenerational conversation, because the young people. And you know, for me, in terms of legacy, it would be wonderful to push it further and actually have a piece that started on the foundation of a conversation between young people and the past generation. Because what came out was that the young people were dealing with their own mental health issues, and they were frustrated that there was no government. And you know, they were like, we understand this thing about processing the past, but we also are affected in the present and don't have a means through which to talk.
Very powerful moment in the performance here, where a mother from the audience spoke about her experience of a child with autism, and that chimed with themes in your piece as well.
Yeah. So I think that kind of that piece of like this processing the past, but how do we bring it into a relationship with the present, and with this generation? It felt like it was something that we just started to we saw the surface of it, but we didn't. It feels like there's a lot more to explore there, which was exciting.
More to explore. I think that's going to be the theme of the session today. We're coming to the closing minutes. Conan, any thoughts either on the impact issue or indeed on the experience as artists of working in this field?
Well, I mean, the impact, I think, just personally as an artist, like just the growth of it is amazing, but also empowering me to try and tell these kind of stories, you know. I mean, we had a screening here in Derry, one in Queens, and then one in Belfast Film Festival. So I got a selection of different audiences. I mean, overwhelmingly very positive and very, like, you know, this is valuable work, you know, to be doing. In some ways, you know, I feel like the film, you know, it's a feature length. You know, it has feature-length teeth in it. You know, so you know, it's something to be expanded on. You know, so it's not. You know, it's not.
We'll think of it just as a trailer.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah. Something I don't want to leave unsaid because we're coming to the closing sections, and there's been references here and there to the pressure on artists doing this kind of work. As one of the artists put it to me, you do a 2-hour interview on a traumatic theme, and then you listen back to it over and over again as you seek to edit and shape it. One of the counsellors that support the programme talked to me about the core principle in counselling of beginning, middle and end, that you have to be so careful when you engage with people, you have to be so careful as you're working with them, but then you need to think what you do with them afterwards. Do you think we've learned any lessons about how to support artists in this process?
I mean, this is the support, right? Like the ability to kind of decompress. So the fact that it isn't just a one-off project, but it is a community and it is a sort of, you know, year-long or multi-year program, it feels like it is the support. And the other thing that when I almost cut you off, I wanted to say, David, like, you know, the Heidegger uncertainty principle or whatever, your measuring has also been, for me, probably the biggest relationship of mentoring, actually. And that actually you're also part of the glue that kind of holds this together and is the artist support, just in the act of kind of being here as a presence, watching it all and trying to learn from it all. So yeah, that's what the Academy does for me.
I think it's important because I think a lot of people over the years, and particularly I look at Northern Ireland now, in my experience, so many extraordinary artists have left the sector because lack of recognition for the work, the level of depression that sometimes you feel or anxiety you feel after being in a project, they leave. And then, of course, the pay, you know, artists traditionally aren't paid well. I don't want to bang on about that, but there seems to be very little incentive for artists to stay within it if they're having to put up with that. So we have lost extraordinary artists who've had valuable experience over the last 40 years and built the sector. You know, we're fundamental in building the sector. So it would be lovely if we could not repeat that and that we could find ways of supporting artists and helping them to stay within it.
Yeah, well, I think as an artist, you get a sense that you're doing your job. That's what your art is for. And I think having the opportunity to use your art form to create more art, to allow people to engage with the art form that you're really passionate about, is amazing. And I think that there should be more opportunities for artists to develop through that.
Well, hopefully this is the start of a continuing process. I know the Playhouse are committed to further work. It was nice to hear you mention the role of Queens in this project, as indeed the Hollywell Trust and the Thomas Darcy Foundation, because, you know, that whole sort of set of partnerships have been crucial. And I would pay a personal tribute to the Playhouse staff, you know. Elaine and Liam we've mentioned. But again, I think there's a general feeling that people involved in these projects feel minded.
Very much.
So, but look, thank you so much for sharing that. As just to emphasize, this is only a small number of the artists involved altogether, but the work is still available in various archival forms. Certainly the podcasting will be heard again, the film can be. And I think there's even talk maybe of a further eye for crack and everything.
I think Declan Keeney might be working on a documentary, hopefully in the future, bringing some aspects of the play.
So hopefully the work will continue to resonate.
Yeah.
And thank you for your attention.
Thank you.